Alright, let's continue with this update statement, update table name, and this is how in general it looks like. I actually took this update statement, I copied it, and after I ran this statement, I modified it, and I made a select statement out of it. So basically select everything from invoice copy where invoice number is that. And we got just one entry. This is the entry that was changed by the query. Let us double check that. Yeah, all right. So we can have an update condition with where update happens. In this case, terms ID is set to a value in case when vendor ID is 95. And you can notice when the changes happen in rows, this is the corresponding statement, how many rows did the change happen in. Of course, we can also use an arithmetic expression. And as usual with delete statements and update statements, the where clause, if you don't have where clause, it just does do the change anywhere, everywhere. So update invoice copy. So we are going to return the value assigned in a subquery. So notice there is a subquery over here. Select max invoice due date from the invoice copy. So the latest date among all invoice due dates will be assigned to this variable where invoice number is this number, and also we update the credit value. Continue to use queries. So in this case, here is our subquery, and this subquery better return only one value because we have a where clause in the update statement where vendor ID equals 2. So there better be just one value returned by this subquery. And it is apparently the case. So in this case, use reset the value of terms ID to 1. And in case you want to change it in a bunch of places defined by a condition, you can select all vendor IDs where vendor state is among these three states. And in this case, you do a where clause with in vendor ID in whatever one column is returned, vendor ID will be this table. Derived table will be just one column vendor ID. Alright, so that is another update statement where credit is changed by $100, by 100 of whatever, and we should concentrate on the subquery first. So select top 10 invoice ID from invoice copy where the balance due is bigger than or equal to 100, and then order it by decreasing by the balance due. So the meaning of this so far is we want to select only places where the balance due is bigger than 100 and give those invoices 100 credit. So this is the only place where it makes sense to give 100 to the credit, to add 100 to the credit. And this subquery is referred to as top invoices. So this is our alias. And now the crucial line is where invoice copy invoice.invoice ID equals to top invoices invoice ID. So we created from this subquery, we created a temporary table, a derived table, top invoices, and we are going to reset the credit total only when in the invoice copy invoice ID is coinciding with invoice ID in top invoices. This can, by the way, you could do a subquery and join them, but this is a little bit of a simplified way of doing it. So from may look a little bit counterintuitive. What we are updating is invoice copy, and the from part of the statement is for creating a subquery that we needed, and in where we are doing we are identifying the by invoice IDs, we are identifying the information selected in top invoices with invoice copy. And of course, we can actually use a join in a where and sorry. So the goal is to set terms ID and do that in invoice copy join vendor copy on invoice copy dot vendor ID equals to vendor ID. Yeah, vendor copy vendor ID, where vendor name is Pacific Bell. So vendor copy contains information column vendor name, and that's why we are doing this join. And actually what we are changing is invoice copy. We're updating invoice copy, and we only update it where there is a match from vendor copy, and also where in vendor copy, sorry, in vendor name, the value is Pacific Bow, and vendor name is in a column in vendor copy. All right, let us look at another example here. And in this example, we are using contact updates, and the contact updates table is given to us below. So some people may have had their first name, last name changed, or last name changed, and this is the new data that corresponds to vendor ID. Now, back in the vendor copy, there were some other first names and last names, and the column name was vendor contact last L name and vendor contact F name. So those are replaced by the values from a different table, contact updates, last name and first name correspondingly. And the from is where the join happens, and where we identify the by vendor ID, the rows from two different tables. And finally, this is almost the last thing in this chapter, that is a delete statement. So delete invoice copy where invoice ID is equal to that. And you can reference what you want to delete by the ID, and that way you can delete certain rows of your table. Or for that matter, by any condition, so vendor ID 37, if you wanted to remove everything in the invoice copy that pertains to this vendor ID. So all paid invoices, that is where the balance due is 0, we can delete all those from invoice copy, and here it says how many rows were affected, namely deleted in this case. And finally, if there is no where, just like with update, if there is no where, the delete applies to all rows, and that will delete all the data from the table, but it will not delete the column names, column information, and it will not delete the table itself. Let us look at the delete statement with a subquery. So in where, as previously, we could use a subquery. In this case, vendor ID is where vendor name is blue cross. And again, since we have an equality, that means that there should be only one value output by the subquery. Of course, we can replace that with a join. In from, we put a join, and we identify by vendor ID, two tables by vendor ID, and then we filter by vendor name equals to Blue Cross. And as previously with update statement, in the where statement we can use not in, and the subquery where we choose a column of values that we need. For example, vendor IDs again. So from invoice copy, we select distinct vendor IDs, and then in the we delete in the vendor copy all the IDs that were not in the invoice copy. All right, and finally, one more, a little bit more complicated derived table. So we delete from vendor copy, from vendor copy join, and here goes a subquery, and as you guess from this seeing the sum, there is going to be a group by. So we are computing sum of invoice totals from invoice copy and group by vendor ID. So per vendor ID, what is the sum of invoice total across all invoices? And we save that as invoice sum and join on vendor ID. Identify those two table rows by vendor ID. And where total of invoices less than 100. Total of invoices is this new column that was created in the subquery. So the point of this is to delete everything from the vendor copy, all rows from the vendor copy, for which the total of invoices among all the invoice totals in the invoice copy table was less than 100, less or equal to 100. And the very last thing that we are going to touch upon is the merge statement. And merge statement allows you to merge tables. There is merge into target table using table source on some join condition, and when matched you can do one thing like update values, and when not matched, that is nothing in the join condition there was no matching values in the join condition, then you can, for example, add something. All right, here is an example we will try to understand right now. So we are merging invoice archive. So this is our target. This is where the old and new data will reside, and we will use invoice copy as IC. And here is the join condition. Invoice, we are identifying them by invoice ID. And now the when parts, when matched, and also IC, that is invoice copy is not null, invoice copy payment date is not null, and payment total bigger than EA, that is the invoice archive payment total. So if in the copy payment total was bigger than the archived payment total, then we are updating with invoice copy. Our invoice archive values are updated using invoice copy values for payment total, credit total, and payment date. And when not matched, then we are just inserting into this invoice archive, we are inserting the corresponding part of the table, invoice copy table. And we're inserting, here is the list of columns, and then the values are basically the values from the invoice copy table. So in this way, the archive table is updated using the values from the invoice copy. And finally, we can also delete rows that aren't matched by the source table. That's it for the week.